I would regard what the Ukrainians are doing at this point, and I really should say the Zelensky regime, what it is doing, is committing acts of desperation. And they're in terrible condition right now. I received some interesting overhead imagery that was sent to me about Ukraine, and it was very interesting because the overhead imagery depicted 123,000 freshly dug graves in Ukraine for Ukrainian soldiers, and talked about 400,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers. This was kind of shocking to me. I had always believed that it was at least 300,000 to 350,000 dead, but I had not seen this assertion. And this comes from a very reliable source. And the idea of more freshly dug graves is deeply disturbing because we see more and more evidence that the Zelensky regime insists on throwing away lives in these pointless attacks on Russian defenses simply as a way to try and persuade people in the West that they are in good shape, they're still fighting, and that we should continue to support them regardless of whatever else they hear. That's a terrible price to pay, and I don't think Ukraine can pay it much longer. Well, Zelensky is in very poor shape politically. I don't think he's very popular inside his own country. We keep insisting that his approval ratings are high, but then again, the same people that tell you that are telling you that the Ukrainians are winning. There was just a little more help, they can be pushed over the finish line and drive the evil Russians out and so forth. There's no chance of any of that happening. That's absurd. The other thing that came through in this report that I thought was extremely disturbing is this business of amputees. Somebody told me recently that I guess they've checked the hospitals and the wards and so forth. There are roughly 60,000 amputations of limbs from Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, this is catastrophic. Again, these are people that will never go back to active duty, and that's the other problem. It's one thing to be wounded if you can recover from it and be returned to active duty. It's quite another when you're so severely wounded, there's no chance of ever coming back again. I think that inside Ukraine, the truth is out. There are enormous problems with recruiting. The secret police is more and more heavily engaged, dragging people kicking and screaming into vans and driving them off to fight in the Ukrainian army. The worst part, of course, is that the people that were trained, that knew anything about their professions, are largely gone or dead. In other words, they've either been wounded or killed, or they've simply vanished. Maybe some of them have surrendered. We do know that surrenders are up, and that's not because Ukrainians don't lack for guts. They are very courageous people. That's not the issue. But Ukrainian commanders look at their units and they have 30, 40, 50 people severely wounded. Their chain of command tells them, well, we can't evacuate you. We can't get them out. At which point in time, he's got to make a decision. Does he let the wounded die? Or does he say, well, I've got about 150 men here or 200 men. I'm going to surrender because I don't want the wounded to die. And the Russians have been good about one thing in particular, and that is they've treated all of the Ukrainians that have surrendered very well. So the Ukrainians know they're not going to be mistreated. They're not going to be murdered or anything else. All of these things point to an imminent collapse of the Ukrainian military. And one would expect something similar eventually with the government. And I don't know what happens next, but I can't imagine anything good happening, because the notion that we can continue the aid and that somehow or another there'll be a magical turnaround is just nonsense. Well, this is unfortunately pretty typical for the Washington political class. Let me explain something. There's a thing called the Montreux Convention. It was signed in 1936 in July, went into force in November. This convention gives enormous authority, with good reason, to the Turks, who control the Bosporus, the Straits. And effectively, it says that warships, first of all ships that are involved in commercial practices, in other words, moving freight, moving cargo, they can all pass without interference. There will be no disruptions to commercial traffic. However, it says, if the Russians, for instance, want to move vessels through the Straits, they can move a certain number through, and then those vessels at some future point, if their home port is in the Black Sea, they can come back through. But that otherwise, foreign ships from the Royal Navy, the United States Navy, from any of the NATO navies, They can't move more than 21 ships through there. And the convention gives the Turks the right to effectively say, we don't want to let you in if we choose not to. At the same time, they can turn to the Russians and refuse them re-entry. If they say, well, the ships that you brought out are not really home ported in the Black Sea, then you can't return your ships to it. Russians had some aircraft carriers, not aircraft carriers as we understand them, that weigh, 100,000 tons. These are much smaller, but nevertheless, they carried helicopters and missiles and so forth. And they had been built in Sevastopol in the Black Sea, but they were not home based there. So when they tried to return these ships, the Turks told them, no, you can't do it. And so they had to take other routes to get where they needed to go. I think most of them sailed around to Vladivostok, some sailed up to the Baltic. But what the senator wants to do is he wants to create a permanent U.S. naval presence in the Black Sea. Well, I think under the terms of the convention, that's probably impossible. In other words, the Turks aren't going to let large numbers of U.S. naval ships, combatant ships, into the Black Sea. That's number one. Number two, in addition to the Montreux Convention, you have the Russian view of the Black Sea, which is it's a Russian lake. They look at the Black Sea the same way we look at Lake Erie or Lake Michigan. These are inland lakes that we control. If it were possible for Russian warships to sail down the St. Lawrence Seaway and into the Great Lakes, I'm quite certain that the American people would be very concerned about that and would object to it. Well, you have a similar attitude in Russia. So I think what's happened here are two things. First of all, this is an opportunity for senators to grandstand, to make irresponsible recommendations, to push through legislation that is meaningless and has no chance of being implemented. And then secondly, no admiral in the United States Navy in his right mind would send large combatant vessels into the Black Sea because it is in strategic terms a puddle. You can't hide anything in the Black Sea. There's nowhere to retreat. So anything that goes in there that from the United States Navy or other NATO navies can easily be identified and sunk. So I guess what I'm saying is that this is more hot air from one of the larger windbags in Washington, Mitt Romney. And people need to pay attention to it because it's this kind of stupidity. It's not really stupidity as much as it is arrogance and self-importance. Can put a lot of American sailors, Marines, soldiers, airmen at risk unnecessarily. And this is an example of where if foolish admirals exist and want to try and push their way through, they may be able to do it. I don't know, but I still don't think the Turks would sign on for it, and they ultimately control the straits.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you from living in Utah, I don't believe Senator Romney will be Senator Romney next year, but different story. Thank you for helping us better understand that. Yeah, the Black Sea just is not as big as many would believe, and you put something big enough, it just becomes a target. Now, you had put out a new article, and I've been reading that Poland is getting very on edge about the Wagner mercenary group doing Belarusian armed forces training close to their border. Does Poland have a reason to worry about Belarus? And secondly, in the article that you authored, you suggested that Poland might be eager to jump into this Ukraine conflict because they believe ultimately Washington, D.C. would back them. Can you give us an idea of what's going on in Poland and also why you think Poland may be getting braver in their desire to push into Ukraine?
Well, first of all, the Poles do not lack for bravery. They're very brave people. They're very excellent soldiers. I would simply say on this particular point that the Polish government doesn't sound like a great repository of common sense, but that's my personal opinion. The Poles have made no secret of the fact that they regard large parts of Western Ukraine and parts of Belarusia as areas that were once part of the so-called Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Now, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the largest state in Europe for most of the period between 1459, when it was established, and let us say the early 1700s or late 1600s. Ultimately, the whole thing fell apart for reasons of internal strife and civil war and disagreements. The idea was eventually to bring in what we today refer to as Lithuania, which was at least half of contemporary White Russia, Ukraine, and Poland together in one great state. It all fell apart before those goals could be realized in 1794, and Poland vanished from the map of Europe. The Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians did not march into Poland with the idea of harming the Poles. They marched in to put an end to Poland because it was seen as a catalyst for war, and its government was viewed as essentially an extension of the French Revolution at the time, which nobody wanted to spread to Central East Europe. That may or may not have all been true, but the point is that that was the end of Poland, at least until after World War I. Now, the Poles have since been interested in regaining everything. They had a war with the Soviets in 1920, where they absolutely smashed the Soviet military out in front of Warsaw, drove the Soviets hundreds of miles back into Russia, and they did acquire some of the lost territory. That, of course, was overturned in 1939 when once again Poland was partitioned, and Poland largely vanished as an actor on the international stage until 45, and then it became a puppet state. Now, the reason I'm bringing all of that up is so that people understand that there are plenty of Poles and Lithuanians in Vilnius and in Warsaw who are looking at what's happening in Ukraine. They see Ukraine is collapsing. Ukraine is losing. It's not going to win. And so they're saying, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to sit here and let it all fall apart? Or are we going to exploit the collapse of Ukraine to move in and seize territory, which is rightfully ours anyway? And they could also build this as, well, you know, we're going in to rescue what's left of Ukraine.
Yeah.
Well, maybe. If you're sitting in Minsk, which used to be part of this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and which is now the capital of Belarus, and you're Mr. Lukashenko, you're very concerned because Poland is a stone's throw away. It's an hour or two less than that from the Polish border to Minsk, the Belarusian capital. So the question is, well, if this is going to happen in Ukraine, let's take advantage of it. And then there's this assumption that if the Poles, the Lithuanians, and some Ukrainians get together and they carve out or try to carve out this new safe zone or security zone or whatever they're going to call it in Western Ukraine, on the grounds that they're protecting Ukrainians and saving it from total absorption or destruction. Once they come into contact with Russian forces, which I think is inevitable, and they start to be systematically annihilated, the assumption is, well, we'll all rush to their defense. The United States Army, some of which is sitting in Romania, some of which is in Lithuania and Poland, will then cross the border and bolster the Polish-Lithuanian position. Well, I guess that's possible. The fact that President Biden very recently signed an executive order granting Americans in uniform in Ukraine hazard pay, which is effectively what we used to call combat pay, suggests to the Russians that we're quite ready to go into Ukraine. Now, they know we've got people on the ground in Ukraine. They've always known that. And we no doubt have taken casualties, although we've managed to keep that very quiet. But the point is, if you juxtapose all of these things together, you're sitting in Moscow, you say, well, I guess it's a good thing that we've held 300,000 Russian combat troops in reserve, because we can always use those if these crazy people in NATO and Washington decide to go into Western Ukraine. Now, my hope is that someone in the White House will say, no, don't do this. You know, this is a very dumb idea. And this is one of the reasons that under great pressure from Lukashenko, Mr. Putin decided to commit some tactical nuclear weapons under Russian control to Belarusian soil to reassure Lukashenko that his tiny state of 8 million people is not going to be bulldozed into submission by the Poles, Lithuanians, or the rest of NATO. But it tells you something about the heightened tensions and the danger of even flirting with these kinds of ideas right now. So the Poles seem to think that they and the Lithuanians, with some sort of mixed force, picking up some Ukrainians, might be able to do this. And you'll recall that General Petraeus, back in the fall, talked about a quote-unquote coalition of the willing that could suddenly be put together from willing NATO forces. We've done this coalition of the willing nonsense in NATO for years because NATO is never ever united on everything. It never has been. You can't get 32 nations to sign up for almost anything at one time. So you're herding cats to begin with. So you start talking about the coalition of the willing that goes into Bosnia, coalition of the willing that goes to Iraq, the coalition of the willing that does X, Y, and Z. But this now looks like it could be a reality if you're sitting in Moscow. And whether or not it is, it's hard for us to tell because you still have people in London and Washington primarily exhorting the Ukrainians to keep fighting when it makes no sense to do so. And you don't know if privately they're encouraging the Poles, Lithuanians, and others to take a hand in all of this. I don't know. I just know that I think it's the wrong action. It's very dangerous. It could not only extend the existing war, but then you run the risk of regionalizing the war. Because as soon as the Poles and the Lithuanians, for instance, step into Western Ukraine, they become targets, not just the forces in Western Ukraine, but all the sites in Poland, inside Lithuania. You'll recall that very recently, last week, the town of Reni that is on the river that borders Ukraine and Romania, a port on that river. This is obviously hundreds of miles to the west. This is right on the border with Moldova and Romania. This port city was being used to offload equipment for the Ukrainians and also to pick up things, including grain, I suppose, from Ukraine and move it out to the Black Sea. The Russians virtually destroyed the entire port facility. They did so with missiles that are almost 1,000 miles away. So this was a great signal to us. If you think that you're going to be able to move with impunity into Western Ukraine and pay no price for it, that's not going to happen. And the last thing we need is for Russian missiles to fall on sites in Poland where our troops are currently billeted. And our troops are in wide open. They're exposed. They're not difficult to find, and they're not difficult to strike.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that'll grab your attention, being able to hit a target 1,000 miles away. Independent journalist Max Blumenthal came on my show last week. He talked about how he calls them the Beltway bandits there in DC, how they're privately saying, we need to end this war. This is awful. We support Ukraine. And yet privately, they're making millions and millions of dollars off of this war by being contractors and connected to the military industrial complex. Do you think there's truth to what Max Blumenthal is saying, where there's this double standard of publicly saying, oh, we need to really support these guys, but privately, they would love this war to go on because they'll get another beach house or another $1 million in the bank? What are your thoughts on that?
Max has really studied this much more than I have. And my experience with Max Blumenthal is that if he tells you something, you can take it to the bank. You can drive through Great Falls and McLean and all these various suburbs, go over to Potomac, Maryland. And yes, you can see all the mansions rising, the lucrative rewards for being involved in pushing this war and pushing this, what I call a cash and equipment swap, where we say we're sending $1 billion worth of equipment to Ukraine. Well, the equipment tends to show up, although a lot of it obviously disappears into the black market, perhaps as much as a third of it or more. But the cash really doesn't get to Ukraine. It's sort of laundered from Congress over to the Defense Department into the military industries. And then, of course, a lot of it finds its way back in terms of profits to people who are shareholders in the industries or working there, or frankly, in the form of campaign contributions to political action committees and so forth. So he's absolutely right. I don't know the details, but I think he's absolutely right. The larger issue here, of course, is that there is now discussion behind the scenes of, well, maybe we should get out of this before this gets worse. There are people saying that in the White House, the Department of Defense, and Department of State, but there's chaos. We've never had a coherent strategy. So what we've had are these outrageous claims and policy stances from which you cannot easily retreat. If you say, we are here until Russia is destroyed and Ukraine is liberated and on and on and on, suddenly it becomes obvious that, well, I'm sorry, Russia's not going away, but Ukraine could vanish. And this war is not going well. It's going badly. And more tanks or F-16s or anything else you send aren't going to make any difference. At that point, you say, well, what am I supposed to do? Say I was wrong? Nobody in Washington ever apologizes for anything. Nobody in Washington ever says they were wrong. But you can hear now in the press other kinds of statements that I think are emanating from the White House, National Security Council staff, probably State Department, and perhaps even DOD. And they're showing up in the Wall Street Journal and in the New York Times and these other outlets. And it says, well, you know, we've given the Ukrainians everything. They just haven't been able to make this work. You know, how can we take blame for something like this? I mean, after all, it was their opportunity and we simply backed them. So this seems to be a way that they will try and conceal their ruthless exploitation of the Ukrainian people for their stupid ideas vis-a-vis Russia. Now, there's one other aspect, and we can't lose sight of this. If you're a member of the ruling globalist neocon clique that runs Washington, London, New York City, the big cities in Europe and Western Europe, you're in an existential battle with Russia. Remember, Russia is this evil state that has a national identity rooted in its culture, its history, its ethnicity, its language. And that's bad, Steve. That's very bad. We globalists and neocons have had tremendous success in Western Europe and in the United States with regard to destroying national identity, in opening borders, in crushing anyone who suggests that human beings have an identity at all, in favor of insisting that all of it is a social construct of no meaning. If we lose to Russia, well, then we're exposed to criticism as frauds, as failures. And things could actually turn around in Europe. National parties could actually come to power. Our position here could be untenable. We've already got problems with people like Donald Trump and RFK Jr., who seem to think there's a place called America and an American national identity and history and culture. So, you know, there's more going on here than we realize. And then finally, there's another level of this conflict that no one is paying attention to, I think, in the United States. When I say no one, most Americans, that's the financial war. And the financial war boils down to this. Russia, China, India, they want to de-dollarize. They want to get out from under our financial system. And we thought that once we sanctioned everybody opposed to us, that they couldn't do business. They wouldn't be able to export anything or import anything. Well, we've turned out to be completely wrong. In fact, once you leave Europe and North America, the rest of the world is quite willing to do business. And so now the Russians have decided, along with the Chinese, and I think the Indians privately have said, we've got to go to gold-backed currency, a new currency, to get out from under the United States. Well, we sort of scoff at that. Remember Bernanke, the former Fed chairman? He testified and said, well, gold doesn't have any real value. And somebody said, well, then why do all the banks maintain it? He said, well, it's a tradition. Well, you know, we all know that's not true. We don't know how far this is going to go. We don't know how rapidly this will progress. But if you're entirely dependent upon this fiat currency, which you can print as much of as you will, this is pretty frightening stuff. And we haven't seen the economic collapse that we anticipated and forecasted in Europe, or excuse me, in Eastern Europe and Asia. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Saudi Arabia announced that they want to host Ukraine on behalf of their OPEC partner, Russia. They would like Russia to stay out of it so that they can really get to the bottom of what Ukraine wants. I'm curious, why do you think Saudi Arabia is trying to make an effort towards bringing peace? Is this genuine? Do they just want to be seen as a peacemaker like China? Or what are your thoughts behind how this will go and Saudi Arabia's, you know, real, what is it they're really trying to accomplish?
I think the first point we need to keep in mind is that the war is disastrous for everyone. Now, obviously, in talking to Max Blumenthal and others, you've identified that there's a minority inside the United States of people that have benefited from it. I'm sure that's also true in France and Britain, to a lesser extent, Germany. But the point is that virtually everybody else sees war as extremely bad for business. You know, the Chinese have wanted this to end for a long time. You can't pursue your one belt, one road, which effectively creates amazing connectivity between the Pacific and the Atlantic that runs through Europe. How do you run the commerce through Europe on high-speed rail? How do you exchange goods and services? Well, you can't do it. So I think it's genuine, because I think the Saudis don't see any benefit to them of watching this disaster unfold. Now, beyond that, what is their goal? Well, I think the Saudis are demonstrating that they've had it with us. You know, I think they've suddenly turned and said, and I see a lot of evidence for this in the press, that they're prepared to walk away from these things called the Abraham Accords. After all, the Chinese have been instrumental in fostering a new relationship with Iran, helping the Gulf Arabs and Saudi Arabia, the Peninsular Arabs, build a new relationship with Iran. That seems to be improving and doing well. So I think in a sense, this is a payback. Russia and China in particular, you've both helped end the conflict here. So we're going to turn our attentions to Ukraine and see if we can help there. Beyond that, you'd have to look at other areas where there could be economic benefits for Saudi Arabia, which, as you know, imports most of its food. And Ukraine and Russia are, you know, the world's leading producers. So I'm sure all of those things are bound up together in one way or another, but I would not dismiss what the Saudis are doing as unserious or insincere. I think it's quite real.
Yeah, I had wondered if maybe, again, the OPEC connection, maybe Russia had asked Saudi Arabia, hey, could you try to step in? And because remember, Putin is looking for someone to come to the negotiating table. And so is it going to be China? Is it going to be Saudi Arabia? Who's going to get this shut down? Because we know it's not going to be Washington, D.C.
No, you're right. For the reasons we discussed at the beginning, Washington can't walk away from this. The other bet that I think privately is being made in Moscow is that governments will turn over in Europe, that you'll see Macron go, probably Scholz and his little group, and that you'll see some shifts in policy as a consequence. You know, we don't know. I think that's probably going to happen. Whether or not the new bunch that comes in is going to make a profound difference that soon is open to question. But clearly, if you look at the popular polling, whatever support the European electorates had for this anti-Russian crusade in Eastern Europe has largely vanished. There is still some support for it, but not on the scale as it was before. I'd say it's probably less than 40 and 30% in most European countries and falling. Even in Poland, I saw a poll quite recently that said that 52% of Poles still favored aid to Poland, or excuse me, to Ukraine, but they did not want to join the war against Russia in Ukraine. Well, you know, again, I hope the Polish government's paying attention. They have elections coming up this fall. But then in some cases, like Poland, you may have a Polish government that says, well, if we jump into this war, we can suspend those elections, much as Zelensky has, stay in power and achieve our aims. I mean, who knows? I mean, it's impossible to know with precision, but I sense that there is no real coherent strategy and no real leadership from Washington. You have, on the one hand, these sort of empty, arrogant, self-important pronunciations coming out of the Senate from people like Romney. And on the other hand, you have people that are wandering around in the dark saying, how do we get out? How do we get out? How do we get out? I wish I could paint a better picture, but I just think it's chaotic at the moment. And somebody needs to stand up and lead us in the right direction. But I wouldn't expect it to happen right now with President Biden in the White House. I mean, there's reason the other day somebody said, what do you think is happening in the White House? I said, I don't know really with, you know, the details, but it looks a lot like Weekend at Bernie's.